I'm coming to share with you tonight some of the things I've learned. I wouldn't say that I am a specialist by any manner of means. That's when you need somebody like Andrea Berry, who actually did a workshop with us last year, who is a professional seed saver, and she's absolutely wonderful. She's fantastic. But we're going to get clobbered. When we get the new trade agreement with Europe, seed saving professionally is going to become even more difficult for the smaller companies like Hope Seeds, because they are going to get hit by all sorts of legislation. So all the more reason why we, as small gardeners, should be saving our seeds, because they are going to be, it's going to have to be seed barter rather than seed sell. It's actually frightening what people are doing. And of course, then you've got the big companies, like a certain company which ought to remain nameless but isn't, that's Monsanto, who sell their seeds right throughout the world, and it's all genetically modified hybrid stuff, and they have now put a form of copyright on their seeds, so you are not allowed to save seed, quite apart from the fact that if you did try, most of your seeds wouldn't germinate because they are hybrid seeds, so you can't win with them. So, you know, we're back to the sort of situation where we have the Aesop's fable of the cricket and the ant. The cricket played away whole summer long, didn't save any seeds, and then came to the ant at the end of the next spring and said, "I'm hungry, I haven't got any seed." And the ant said, "Forget it, I'm not sharing my seeds." Well, luckily, Fredericton has got Seedy Saturday, which is the Fredericton Botanic Gardens Association, and they share their seeds very readily with people. So that's good. And we had our own seed exchange here and plant exchange here last year, earlier in this season, so it was great. It was fantastic. So this young lady is somebody who shares my greenhouse with me, and she shares my seed drying spot. Well, yes, she gets a lot more seeds than I do quite a lot of the time. So what seeds? I never saw seeds. Oh no, you did. You ate them. So we're looking at seed saving success, the hows, the whys, and the wherefores. So, next one. Next. Why save and store seeds? Well, we want to maintain our seeds in a viable state so we can grow them the following year. A seed is, after all, an embryo. It's the same as any animal's embryo. It's just that it's drier than most embryos, let's face it. So, and we've got to keep that in a state of what is called stasis, in other words, keeping it cool, dry, and dark, so that it doesn't start germinating, but that it is ready next spring to grow again. So that's what we're looking for. So that's the viable state. We'll come back to some definitions in a minute. It's easy. It can be a trifle smelly when you do the fermentation process with your tomato seed, which is fun. It's cheap. It saves on buying more seed. And it often is the end of a harvest, because these beans, for instance, they were getting a bit beyond the eating stage. They were getting a bit much. These are yellow wax beans. They were getting a bit tacky and a bit sort of whatever. They're not fully dried yet, but it was a way of saving myself some seeds and saving myself some good seed, which is a yellow wax for next year. We do it for special plants as well. If there's a specific plant that we particularly like, I've got a very nice tomato this year, which is a paste tomato called Amish paste. It's taking an awful long time to ripen, but they're big, and they're a big paste tomato, and they're really nice. But I want to save the seeds from that because I want to use them again next year, and it's an heirloom variety. It's open pollinated, so yeah. There might be a special flower that you want to save the seed from because you like the color. It might be that that specific plant is also very good in the area that you live in, and it's disease resistant, it's weather resistant, it's pest resistant, so you want to save that specifically for that. And the professionals obviously are saving seeds in gene storage banks because they want to keep these old heirloom plants like the red fife wheat, which is way back in history, so that if anything ever went wrong, if we had another atomic bomb problem, which is getting closer, we would actually have these things. They are in bomb-proof vaults, they are deep underground, they are hermetically sealed, they are temperature controlled, they cost millions to keep every year. The biggest one's in Britain, the second biggest is in Norway, the third biggest is in Australia, and then there's one in South Africa as well. And there's one here in Canada, up near the Arctic somewhere actually, to keep it, away from the big cities, what might get bombed or whatever. They are keeping these things in cryogenic storage, and they're keeping them to protect the gene pool. And that is really, really important. We never think of that. We just think, oh, well, we're gardening for our own sakes. But if anything did happen to the world, or parts of the world that needed to be completely rebuilt, we would at least have those seeds to start the whole evolution process again of growing our own food. And food, after all, we are so dependent on food. It is frightening. Food security and food safety are very, very big issues today. So we need the seeds. We need to learn, more and more of us need to learn how to save seeds. So choose the best. Have a look at that picture. That is of an ordinary African marigold. Okay, we're going to have a look at another picture later of what they've done to genetically modify those African marigolds, because that's the original single, very straightforward plant, and that is a wonderful plant to use to deter pests. It's the one that I use extensively, but it doesn't chase away potato beetles. Sorry, that's one thing it doesn't do. So go for the best plants, go for the best ones that are going to give you quite a few seeds. Obviously, that's quite a reasonable. I'd already picked probably a couple of pounds off that plant when I took it out of the ground recently. That's a reasonable sized cucumber, I would think. But I've let that one go to that colour, and it should actually have stayed on the vine, but I bought it tonight because it had actually fallen off. Best plants for vigour and for yield. Best seed pods. Obviously you don't want ones that are damaged or diseased or got mildew on them. You want best for your own weather conditions. So obviously Eastern Canada is completely different from subtropical South Africa. So look at that. Insect resistance, the ones that the insects didn't manage to chew up. Anything that's to do with vegetables obviously is flavour. You're going to take the beans that are the most flavourful, whether you take tender green or whether you take provider, or whether you actually go to the pole beans, if you prefer your pole beans. I've got a lot of pole beans that are still sitting on the pods are still on the poles, because it's best to try and let things actually dry out on the original vine if you can, except possibly tomatoes. Disease resistance, obviously, and the best for your area, which I've already really covered. Open pollinated plants, hybrids, heirloom varieties. These are being bandied around a lot. They're all terms that they use in horticulture. Open pollinated is basically that you're not going to sit there with a paintbrush, literally taking the pollen off the male flower and putting it on the female flower, and then covering it with a bag and saying, that is the best because I'm cross-pollinating. That's what the professionals do when they're cross-pollinating stuff. So open pollinated is out in the field, it's the wind, it's the bees, it's you inadvertently knocking whatever to get the actual pollination happening. It's not an enforced pollination. So that's, and these definitions are on that sheet as well. Hybrids, F1 hybrids. F1, can you remember way back at school doing Mendel and the whole situation about Mendel and his peas, the red ones and the white ones, and then you get two pink and one white and one red? Yeah, that's genetics. Well, that's the start of genetics. My daughter could give you miles and miles and miles of genetics. It's got a lot more complicated than that. But the F1 variety is the actual, you've taken two slightly different plants, crossed them, and you will get the four different, you'll get the dominant gene, the recessive gene, and then you'll get the two crosses. That's the hybridization. Now, there are actually people who are now officially copyrighting their hybrids because they don't want other people growing their plant. So be careful if ever you do start trying to grow roses from certain places. Some of the new things like the husk-up berry, they are all stamped with a copyright. And you're breaking the law if you do actually try and either graft them onto something else or grow them from seed. Heirloom varieties are the older varieties, the ones that are tried and true and tested. We use an awful lot of heirloom tomatoes, heirloom potatoes here, and the good old Cortlands and the Macintoshes and whatever. They're all pretty aged in terms of the fact that they've been around a long time, they've been tried, and they are very, very good, and they work in Eastern Canada. So that's basically what that's all about. Seed viability is what I've already talked about, is basically that we're looking at keeping that embryonic plant so that it will actually grow. The viability is not just germination, it's actually growing and growing into a plant as such. Germination is that state of being no longer a seed, but actually growing some leaves and some roots and getting on with growing. That little beastie. I'll talk about that later. And annual, biennial, and perennial. Annual plants grow, seed, and die within 1 year. Biennials take 2 years. They normally grow for a year, and then in the spring of the following year they flower, and then seed at the end of that second year. So that's things like parsley and carrots and sweet williams in the flower world, various plants. And perennials are the ones that you shove in the ground and actually dig them out, split them up, and off they go. They will produce seeds. Peonies produce seeds. But what we tend to do is we propagate not by seed, but by splitting them up. So that's basic, very, very basic terminology. Right, the equipment that you're going to need. Very simple. A sieve, silica gel or powdered milk as a desiccant. We'll come back to that in a moment. A permanent marker, some labels, paper towel, paper bags, some sort of platter to put your stuff on, and something that will remove the hulls and the husks and chaff or anything like that. In fact, the bigger farmers tend to use a flail or a thresher, which is a stick with either a piece of rope on it or a piece of leather. And they actually beat the seeds out of their masses and masses of bean plants or whatever. And space. This is my problem at the moment. I've got seeds on every single surface you could think of. My husband says to me, "You can't put seeds on the deep freeze. I can't get in there to get my liver out." So he's not too charmed with me at the moment. When you've got that little squirrel body looking at your seeds when you've got them out, you have a problem because the little squirrel has 3 friends. They're 3 chipmunks. So I'm having to sort of ward them off as well, so it doesn't help very much. But anyway, the sieve is more for things like wet seeds, which we'll come on to in a minute, because you're going to use that to sift through the water, well, the mushy mess to get your tomato seeds out. The silica gel and the powdered milk. Powdered milk is just well, not cheaper version, but I suppose it is if you don't have a lot of silica gel. To dry out the seeds, to put in the bag with, say you've got a sweet corn husk and you're trying to dry it, but you can't. Bad to put them in plastic bags, by the way. It's better to put them in paper bags, but I just grabbed a bag this morning. This will help you dry out, the last little bit of drying out to do, and also for storage. Paper towel, paper bags, well, I just put paper towel on everything and I put my seeds on that. And if your seeds get stuck to the paper towel, all you do is you cut around it and plant the seed with the paper towel. And it's actually a form of carbon and it helps them grow. So you can't win, it's a win-win situation. Paper bags are far better than plastic bags for storage, especially if you haven't dried your stuff out completely. And it takes often up to 6 weeks to dry stuff, especially in this weather at the moment, because the humidity is so bad in the air, unless you've got a really dry house. The platters, well, that's just to put all your different seeds on, and the flail or whatever. So silica gel I don't know where to get silica gel here. Does anybody know? Normally you used to be able to get it at camera shops because everybody used it to save film. No ideas? No? Oh dear, pity. The other thing is to try pharmacies. And the third possibility is if you can find anybody who does supplies for dried flowers, they might have silica gel. But I often get little bits and pieces of silica gel from all over the place, and I collect them. They come with toner cartridges and things like that quite often. So I just grab and grab and grab. But you're supposed to replace them every 6 months because they tend to dry out. But you can put them back in a very, very low oven to dry out. So if you have silica gel that's got a little bit wet, put it in a very low oven and leave it for a couple of minutes and it should dry out again. So powdered milk, to keep seeds dry, wrap 2 heaping teaspoons of powdered milk in 4 layers of facial tissue. Then put the milk packet inside the storage container with the seed packets. And that should keep them dry. So that's one little one that I did learn the other day. And that's supposed to read desiccants at the top, but the picture's gone over the top of it. Okay, so into storage. Now, this little beastie, my dear little squirrel beastie, she stores her seeds in my garbage can. She's actually she ate that hole in the garbage can, and that garbage can contains wild bird seed, but she's been putting the sunflower seed in with the wild bird seed. So she's starting to store for herself for the winter. So jars are not a bad idea, but seeds do need a certain amount of oxygen to keep going. So don't use the full mason jar screwed down hard, because you'll actually take the air out of it, and that seed is going to find it quite difficult to stay sufficiently dormant. It might die on you. So be careful of any jar with a really good seal. This is where you start using up all your old bought salsa jars instead of mason jars, because their lids aren't as good. Or the coffee jars that you get, they are perfect. Plastic bags, yes and no, depends. I don't tend to use them very much, but I've read that you can use them. So long as, if you're using this sort of bag, which is FDA food type bag, I would probably put a couple of small holes through it, just with a pin or a thumbtack or something like that, just to give it, especially if you're going to seal it really thoroughly at the top. Because again, you need a certain amount of whatever. But the main storage situation, dry, cool. Everybody says use a fridge. If you've got space in your fridge, I don't have space in my fridge to put seeds. But I've got an old fridge that no longer works, which I use as a seed store, because the mice can't get into it. So, cool, definitely. Don't go into a freezer though. Freezers are too cold for seeds, unless you're doing proper cryogenic storage, which none of us are going to be doing, and dark. Because I put a whole lot of potatoes into very, very dry peat last year, and I put them in the only room that has absolutely no windows in our house, and yet, in the spring, when I went to get them out to actually use them as seed potatoes, they'd grown that much already. So don't believe that what's dark is dark. It's not really. I don't know how they grew, and they were green. And there's possibly that much under the door that they might have got as light. But it's just crazy. You know, if anything is the slightest bit light, you're going to have fun. Yep. So fridges, yes. Freezers, no. Closets. If you've got a closet that is not like our house, where it's over 100 years old and it's not mouse-proof. So you have to watch. We have to watch out for mice as well. So that's great. Don't forget to date your containers. And the other thing, of course, is name whatever you've put in there, because you might put lettuce seed in, but you can't remember whether that's black-seeded Simpson or iceberg or one of the others. And I'm sitting there scratching my head. Well, I put black-seeded Simpson in very early in the year because it'll grow when it's really cold. But if I was going to put one of the butterhead lettuces in. I wouldn't put it in so early in the year. I'd put it in later in the year because it would grow later. So must mark what you put in. Because again, if I'm going to put beans in, unless I know exactly which bean it is, I could be planting a green bush bean or a yellow wax bush bean. It could be tender green, it could be provider, it could be this yellow wax. So again, make sure. And away from these little beasties, because, oh boy, she actually ate that whole, and it's the size of her body. She ate that whole in less than 1 day. I went in there that morning, took the feed out for the outside birds. By the time I came home at 5 o'clock that evening, she'd eaten that whole and she was in there. The best thing is to get steel garbage bins. I'm learning. Anyway, so we have 3 types of seed. We have a dry seed, we have a semi-wet seed, and we have a very wet seed. Other people do it when they're doing sort of seed saving on websites and whatever. They do it by annual, biennial, or perennial. But I thought we might look at them slightly differently. So many of your flower seeds are dry seed. In other words, poppy seeds, calendula, which is the one in the guy's hand there, or the nigella, which is lavender mist, a little blue and white and purple lavender mist. Anybody know it? It's a very nice little flower actually, and it only grows about so high. It's a very dainty flower, and if anybody wants seed of that, I've got masses. So lettuces, obviously. Now, yes, one bolted lettuce. That was part of the summer. When it got so hot, they just took off. And I didn't have, I'd eaten myself stupid on. This is black-seeded Simpson, and it's a very fine seed. And it's one of those, like a dandelion. It's a very light little seed on the end of a white flyaway fluff. And they self-seed very, very easily. So, yeah, lettuce. Beans and peas, obviously. Now, to test whether a bean is dry or not, this is one thing I have found out, learned over the years, is you take it out of the pod. The pod should be sort of dry and husky and whatever. And if you can get your thumbnail or fingernail into the seed, it is not yet dry. It's got to be hard. So these peas, which I've got here, are actually, these have been drying for a very long time, and I can't, I could drop these and they wouldn't shatter at all. So, and those pea pods are, oops. This is basically a good pod because it hasn't got any marks on the outside. Okay. This is basically a not so good pod because it's showing signs, and I've split it open. It's had some sort of slightly moldy growth on it. So again, choose preferably the unmoldy pods because these might be affected. These seeds might be affected by what's on the outside of the actual pod. Carrots. Now carrots, of course, take 2 years, and you're going to get what they call an umbel, which is the sort of great big seed head, and they are almost like dill seeds. Dill carrots, parsnips, and all those sort of seeds are very similar. They're very small. They take not as long as some of the others to dry, but viability, especially parsnips, is not easy at all. Parsnips will give you possibly about 10 to 35% germination from home seed. It's that and corn are probably 2 of the most difficult to grow from home seed, because, well, even so, even with the professional seeds guys, you're not always going to get a very good germination of parsnips, for instance. So that's the situation there. Dill and coriander, very, very easy to seed save. Just they dry on the plant. You just take them off the plant, pop them in. Buckwheat's another one that's nice and easy to save. But buckwheat is used as a green manure, as a green compost. It's probably the easiest to grow because it hasn't got enormously deep roots, and it has very pretty flowers, which are very good for pollinators. So that's something that, as you took your sort of midsummer stuff out of your garden, you should be putting that in so that it's now fully grown now, because that will make a very good green manure for you. So, semi-wet seeds. That's actually some of the bell peppers that I've saved this year, and that was, well, those were pretty close to dry, but the actual, there was just a pepper there to show you. So, peppers, corn, and this, I've had, actually had this on a windowsill, and it's pretty well ready to strip now, and that's really dried up. You certainly wouldn't want to eat that. You might find one or two little rodent mammals that might want to eat that, but that had got to the stage where it wasn't all that edible, so I thought I'd try it out. But there are a couple of kernels up the top there that are not too good, and I would get rid of those because they're blackened and they're not too good. Normally around the top you're not going to get a very good viability. It's further down this sort of down the shank of the actual corn ear that you're going to get a better seed and a better viability. Okay, wheat, if you grow wheat, fine. Oats, and I tend, I'm not supposed to, I don't think so, but anyway, I tend to save seed from wheat and oats because I use them as green crops, and so of course then I don't have to rebuy the next year. Beets you can save seed from quite easily, but that again is a 2-year process. And garlic bulbils. Now, I always thought that garlic produced seed, and I was absolutely amazed to read that there are only 3 plants in the world that they've found recently that have produced garlic seed. What they produce instead is a bulbil. I'm going to pass this around. And these are actually baby garlic. And somebody phoned George Scott the other day, phoned in on that, on George Scott's program, and said she had some of these, and she was going to try and grow them. Well, I tried, and it took me 3 years to grow even the start of a garlic plant. And it really does. It takes a long time to get garlic going from this sort of situation. But if you really like your garlic, and you've got a problem whereby later on in the season the garlic's got powdery mildew or one of the mildews or rotted or something like that, if you've still got a few that you didn't take off at scapes when it was still green and you could cut them off and use them for pesto, then you get these. And that's...
They grow up from the top.
They grow up at the top, yeah. They're basically the seed head. But they're not a seed as such. They are baby bulbs of the garlic. And you get this also with the Egyptian walking onion, which is an onion that grows another set of little baby onions on top, almost as its flower, and then that drops onto the ground, and there's what happens. I actually dug that up about 9 o'clock last night. Radishes are another very easy thing to dry out and use, and obviously things like kale and the brassicas, all not so much cabbage, but collard greens, kale, broccoli. Broccoli is the easiest of the cabbage family to actually let go to seed. If you want cabbages to go to seed, you cut across in the middle of the cabbage when it's still reasonably small, and it will actually send up seed heads. But it's, again, it's, is it worth it? I'm sorry, I'm lazy. So, eggplants, squashes, pumpkins, cucumbers, melons are all wet seeds as far as I'm concerned, and tomatoes are a little bit different. So with this, what I would do, this is actually not an F1. Now watch out, many cucumbers are hybridized, so they're not going to grow particularly well. But this is Summer Dance or Regal, I can't remember, one of the two. Split it down the middle and scoop out the pips. Then put them aside in a sieve and just rub them gently in that sieve so that they lose their gel, the gel that's around them, right? Because there's a gel around most of these pips. It's part of the protection of them. And then put them onto your paper to dry. And much the same with tomatoes. Tomatoes, what I do is I take out the central section, which has got the seed in it, and I put it in an ordinary yogurt tub. Leave it for 3 to 5 days, but not longer than that. it ferments and it gets to really not smell very nice, especially if it's been fairly warm. Then you put it through the sieve, you rub out all the flesh, and you wash it out, wash it out, wash it out, and then put it out on the paper to dry. And that's the way I do it, but I know other people have other ways of doing it. But the fermentation method, if you leave it for too long, it actually kills the seed. So don't go more than 3 to 5 days on tomato seed. But it's a pretty smelly job, it's a pretty mucky job, but it's well worth it. Eggplant I'm not particularly good on. I did try eggplant, and again, I didn't have a good germination, so I don't know what I did wrong, but I didn't do it too well. But I have to tell you about some pumpkin seed that we had. I collected over last winter, I collected quite a lot of compost from Real Food Connections, because they were throwing out, they were making pumpkin soups and things. And I put it in my garbage cans, which I do over winter, inside the greenhouse. And it was with straw, and it all broke down quite nicely. But there were quite a lot of seeds in there. And I didn't think anything of it, so I did some lasagna layering in a hurry. Didn't take these seeds out, and well, the only thing that grew in this lasagna bed, which was about 9 foot square, was about 400 pumpkin seeds. I gave them to Keswick Ridge School. I gave them to all my friends, and I hope they grew. They were all acorn, and I put 2 into the greenhouse alongside some stuff that I had there. One grew 50 foot long that way, and then it went up, and it came all the way back along my shade cloth. So it grew about 100 foot long. It's got 16 pumpkins on it, so I think I did pretty well over that lot. But beware, if you're composting pumpkin seeds, you're likely to get a volunteer crop, and plenty of them at that. It was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. Melons, again, just be careful. Melons are often hybridized, especially watermelon. So they're not necessarily going to grow that easily. And they might not come true to, you've got this lovely round watermelon that's only about sort of 4 or 5 pounds in size. You might grow, if the hybrid did grow back and it reverted to the original, you might get a 20 foot sort of long, great big 25 pound melon. So just be careful with melons, because they can be a bit difficult. Well, they're often hybridized. And again, I've actually marked, that is on a plastic, a paper plate. It's got winter squash written underneath it. So if that piece of paper falls off, the piece of ordinary paper towel, where I've written winter squash on it, at least I'll know that it's from that plate. And so that's how I make sure that I know what's what. But that squash is, it's actually, I should have put on there Hubbard. All right, tubers and bulbs are a form of seed in a sense. So I just put a little mention of them in. Looking at gladiolus, dahlia, onions, garlic, those bulbils, potatoes obviously, things like horseradish, which you propagate from just the roots, and other summer bulbs that we all take out that we don't want to freeze up over the winter. I tend to put most of those sort of things into peat to store them over the winter in a fairly small box, fairly deep peat. Put them in the middle, shut them down. Don't take them down too much if you can help it, because again, they've got to breathe. But you'll get the same problems I had with my potatoes. They might just pop up. Gladiolus are slightly special because they've got an old corm, a new corm, and these little cormlets that you often find on them when you lift them. The old corm you should try and take off and discard because it's not going to regrow. The new corm is the big new bulb that you've got there. And the cormlets you should really also take off if you can. They will grow. I'm on my 3rd generation in 3 years of gladiolus. But again, they are finicky and fussy because they're tiny little things. And to try and grow them on, you've got to have perfect soil conditions, you've got to have perfect weather conditions. I had about 10%, 15% success with growing gladiolus corms onwards. So they're a bit finicky. Try and take the bigger ones off and just discard the little tiny ones. They really aren't worth doing much with. So that's those. And dahlia, of course, you can do year after year after year. They will come again. Problems. Damping on off and fungus. Well, I know much about that because A, we've got a leaky old, drafty old house. And B, as I say, South Africa is not the place to go and try and seed save because of the wetness of it. It virtually never dries out where we were living. So if we weren't having summer rains, which are really heavy, torrential rain, we were having pretty wet winters. They never really dried out because we were down on the coast. So you have to watch. If your seed is not dry enough, it will damp off. It will get fungus problems. If your seeds are spaced too closely, you'll find that they clump together and then they'll quite often damp off as well, especially things like beet seeds, tomato seeds, that sort of thing. You've got to try and get them, when you actually put them out on the paper, try and spread them out evenly if you can. And obviously the weather is going to play quite a major factor. And if your seeds freeze, they're likely to die. So you have a problem there. So hydrogen peroxide is a good remedy for fungus, or actually it's a guard against fungus. 1 teaspoon in 1 litre of water. You dip your seed in it for just literally a few minutes. Don't leave it overnight or anything like that. And then put it out to dry, because that will stop any fungal, it should stop a lot of fungal development. Bob Osborne from Cornhill Nursery swears by hydrogen peroxide. He won't use chlorine. He actually uses hydrogen peroxide to clean all his greenhouses and for this sort of job as well. So he's a hydrogen peroxide man in a big, big way. Try to dry your seeds in the driest and warmest part of the house. That's the one time that you do actually put your seeds in something warm, but don't put them in the oven to dry them, because even at the very coolest ovens, which are normally about 170 centigrade, they will die. They'll get overheated and they will die. Dry at least for 2 to 6 weeks before you store them. Germination and viability testing. Germination testing to see what sort of percentage germination you're going to get. You wrap 10 seeds in wet paper towel, place them in a sealed plastic bag, leave them in a moderately warm spot for several days. This is what I do in the spring, and check the number that have actually germinated, and that will give you the percentage germination of, say, your whole corn ear or whatever. And it's pretty good. It'll, you know, you get a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. Some seeds just don't germinate. Somewhere along the line something's gone wrong and they don't. Viability, that's to see whether they actually might germinate. You drop your seeds into a jar of water. Those that float will definitely not germinate. They have died. Especially things like cucumber seed, pumpkin seed, whatever. The very thin, the thinner and flatter they are, the less likely they are to germinate. Especially those flat seeds like pumpkins and cucumbers, that sort of thing. So if they're very, very thin and papery, you can be pretty sure that they are not going to germinate. They've got to be convex on both sides. Yes, convex on both sides, and nice and fat and juicy and make you want to eat them. Any seed that sinks will. And in fact, when you're doing your seed saving from your tomatoes, anything that pops up to the top, drain that off before you take the seeds out of the bottom of the jar, because the ones in the bottom of the jar are the ones that are good, and they will, if you dry them, they'll be okay. The top ones have probably not developed in sufficiently to be useful. And then I found this really fascinating. We're talking about viability. Now, most vegetable seeds, corn and parsnips and onions, don't normally last more than a year. So you need to replace them every year. But most of your standard vegetable seeds will last up to 5 years, so long as you've kept them in a reasonably good environment. So I've got some carrot seed that I've had now since I arrived here, and that's 4 years ago. And it's still viable. It's still actually, I'm planting it, it's still coming up. But I couldn't believe this. 30,000-year-old Silene, which is a little sort of flowering grass almost, flowered this year in Russia. They found these seeds. They carbon dated them. They were found in a rodent's burrow in Siberia, in the where the permafrost is actually now melting away. Just like, did you see that thing about the mastodon the other day? They found a mastodon in the permafrost in Siberia. Boy walking along the beach looked across and his dog went to snuffle this thing. This thing still had flesh on it. So they've taken it back to Moscow and they're doing all sorts of genetic, testing on it and this, that, and the other. But this is a Silene. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of it. But a Silene is a little, very thin grass type with a little sort of star-shaped flower on it. Well, there are millions of them the world over. And then a 10,000-year-old lupin from Siberia grew and flowered in the last couple of years as well. Again, they'd carbon dated that. And then a 2,000-year-old date palm has been growing since 2003. They found that in King Herod's palace when they were digging it up a couple of years back. This is in a place called Masada, which is out in the Sinai Desert. It's one of the, it's a very, 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 very dry desert, that. And they found this date seed, planted it and thought, well, let's try. And there it is, it's growing. But they haven't yet managed to sex it because dates are either male or female, the trees. But it's not big enough yet to be able to tell whether it's going to be a male or female tree. And I just thought that was just amazing. So we have hope for seeds that we are now saving that future generations will be using. So, seed exchanges. Fredericton Botanical Gardens Association, that's not society, sorry, it's association. They have a Seedy Saturday. If you're a member, you get the seeds free. It's $20 for membership per year. It's held at their offices at Cameron Court, and they have masses of seed. Because there are some guys there who are serious seed savers. And you can go there, you can collect your seeds, you can ask them any questions you like, and they will tell you how to grow things. They've got trilliums, they've got all sorts of stuff. And they get given a lot of seed from the seed companies as well. So that's a really good place to go. NB Change, Seed Swap, and Plant Swap, which we did this year. And the Fredericton Botanical Gardens Association has a plant sale in May. So if you missed actually starting to plant your seeds in time, you can go there and buy. And their peppers and their tomatoes are really worth buying because I got some really good results from them. And there are lots of online seed exchanges as well, especially down in the States. It's really catching on in the States. We've got to start doing that here as well. So just go online, put in seed exchange, and see what you can find. And this is the opposite of seed saving. This is the same little lady, and she's helping herself liberally. I share, as I say, the greenhouse with 3 chipmunks and her, and they have all the best tomatoes. And I was growing a squash, which is a little round cannonball squash, which actually I bought the seeds back from South Africa. And they like them when they're tiny, when they're sort of about that size. I wasn't too charmed about that. But anyway, you've got to do what you've got to do, and you've got to share with the creatures of the world. So those are my contact details. If anybody needs to contact me, please feel free to. I've been having some conversations with quite a few people who came to the original earlier in the season workshops, and it's been very interesting.